is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted in accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. I invite the representatives of Iraq and Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following. I invite the permanent representative of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting. It is so decided. Now, in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Deputy Commissioner General for Operational Support of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, Madam Antonia Marie de Meo, and Deputy Special Coordinator, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Muhannad Hadi. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2. I now give the floor to Madam Antonia Marie de Meo.
Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you for giving UNRWA this opportunity to brief the Security Council at this pivotal time. UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, but it's facing enormous challenges. Gaza is in ruins. The threat of a larger regional war looms. At the same time, the agency is under unprecedented attack, including imminent threats of being expelled from occupied East Jerusalem and being designated a terrorist organization by the Israeli parliament. Our operating space in the occupied Palestinian territory is shrinking by the day. These developments demand the urgent attention and action of this council. Mr. President, for nearly 10 months now, Palestinians and Israelis have lived through untold suffering, grief, sorrow, and loss. More than 2 million people in Gaza remain trapped in an endless nightmare of death and destruction on a staggering scale. Their lives are dominated by fear, thirst, hunger, disease, dehumanization, lack of basic sanitation, and repeated displacement. It's a relentless and often hourly struggle, day in and day out. Famine remains a risk, including in southern Gaza. Communicable diseases are on the rise. Children are bearing the brunt. With 625,000 deeply traumatized children out of school. Prior to October 7th, half of them attended UNRWA schools. With this war coming so soon after the COVID-19 pandemic, we risk depriving an entire generation of girls and boys of formal education, sowing the seeds of hatred, resentment, and future conflict. Education cannot wait. That is why, even amidst the enormous challenges of war, we are committed, together with our UN partners, to resume learning for all the children of Gaza. It starts next week with providing mental health and psychosocial support, transitions to teaching reading, writing, and math in informal settings, and culminates in a return to formal education in schools. Members of the Council, the Security Council has already adopted several resolutions aimed at ending this war through a ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and the scaling up of humanitarian aid. UNRWA has thousands of staff on the ground, spearheading the humanitarian operation in close cooperation with other UN agencies. We have welcomed the adoption of these resolutions in New York. But in Gaza, we have seen woefully little impact. Instead, the fight continues without reprieve, and the suffering continues to mount. As my colleague, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator Muhannad Hadi will describe in greater detail, delivering humanitarian aid remains an impossible task amidst military operations, insecurity, lawlessness, damaged and destroyed infrastructure, fuel shortages, and access and telecommunications restrictions. In Gaza, the blatant disregard for international humanitarian law is now commonplace. Women, children, journalists, humanitarian workers, all continue to pay a tragically high price. UNRWA is no exception. 199 colleagues have now been killed, the vast majority with their families. Nearly 2/3 of the agency's premises, some 190 buildings, have been hit, some twice. Many of our schools are demolished and can no longer be used as schools. In the past 2 weeks alone, 8 UNRWA schools, all serving as shelters for displaced people, have been struck. Our headquarters offices in Gaza are destroyed beyond recognition. More than 560 displaced people, including many women and children, have been killed while sheltering under the UN flag. And just this week, 2 UN convoys heading north were shot at, despite coordination, deconfliction, and authorization from the Israeli army. Humanitarian workers must never be targets of war. They must be protected at all times and in all locations. But in Gaza, too often they have come under attack, been injured, and even killed. We have said it many times before, and I repeat it again. No place is safe in Gaza. No one is safe, including humanitarian aid workers. Members of the Council, concerted efforts to dismantle UNRWA continue unabated. As I speak today, many UN staff, as well as staff of NGOs, have been refused visas to enter Israel. The visa of the UNRWA Commissioner General expired more than a month ago and has not yet been renewed. And for UN staff who have been granted visas, most are only 2 or 3 months long, requiring repeated and lengthy bureaucratic processes. Misinformation and disinformation about UNRWA is spreading on social media, at times crossing the line of incitement to violence. This puts all our colleagues at serious risk, especially in the occupied Palestinian territory. Earlier this week, on July 22nd, Israel's parliament approved in first reading 3 draft legislative bills related to UNRWA. One, seeking to ban UNRWA operations in occupied East Jerusalem. A second, seeking to revoke UN privileges and immunities afforded to UNRWA since 1949. And a third, designating UNRWA a terrorist organization. To become law, these draft bills must still pass through second and third readings by the Knesset. These bills make a travesty of the multilateral responsibilities of member states. They erode the very foundations of international law and multilateral norms. If these bills pass, which could happen as early as next week, the ramifications will be dire and immediate. They will put all UNRWA staff and the agency's General Assembly mandate in direct danger. And while UNRWA will face the impacts today, make no mistake, the entire UN system around the world will feel the impacts tomorrow. We cannot afford this to become a new standard for future humanitarian operations in conflict zones around the world. Mr. President, the campaign against UNRWA is often framed by detractors as motivated by the agency's alleged failure to uphold the humanitarian principle of neutrality. Following serious allegations that several UNRWA personnel in Gaza were involved in the abhorrent attacks against Israel on October 7th, the Office of Internal Oversight Services, OIOS, opened an investigation, and the Secretary General launched an independent review of how UNRWA upholds neutrality in its work. The OIOS investigation into the allegations against these individuals is ongoing. If any of these allegations is proven to be true, this would constitute an appalling betrayal of Palestine refugees, UNRWA, and UN values. Meanwhile, the independent review published its findings in April. It confirmed that UNRWA, and I quote, possesses a more developed approach to neutrality than other similar UN or NGO entities. The review further emphasized that protecting neutrality is a shared responsibility between the United Nations and member states, especially member states where UN entities are based, including Israel. UNRWA is fully committed to implementing the review's recommendations together with member states in this spirit of shared responsibility. And to this end, we thank the members of this council for signing the statement on shared commitments to UNRWA. Together, we must push back against calls to dismantle the agency. UNRWA is targeted because of its role in safeguarding the rights of Palestine refugees and because it embodies the international community's commitment to a just and lasting political solution. UNRWA exists because a political solution does not. It exists because a Palestinian state that can deliver public services in its place does not. Mr. President, to reopen the pathway to peace, we need the support of this council. Please allow me to conclude with 3 asks, urging you first to persist in your efforts to secure a ceasefire. This should bring desperately needed respite to the people of Gaza and the region, the immediate release of all hostages, and an increase in the flow of humanitarian supplies and commercial goods into Gaza. Second, to protect the mandate of UNRWA, including within the framework of a transition. UNRWA must continue providing services until a political solution is at hand. There is no credible alternative to UNRWA in Gaza and across the region. We need political and financial support now more than ever to continue our vital task of serving one of the most vulnerable communities in the world. And we hope that this council will speak out in one voice against attacks, legislative or otherwise, on the agency. Third, and finally, to advance a peaceful solution to this 7-decade-long conflict. The longer the war in Gaza persists, the further we drift from achieving a peaceful solution that will bring Palestinians and Israelis together, recognize our shared humanity, heal, and learn to live side by side in peace and security. This solution must also, at long last, bring an end to the plight of Palestine refugees. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Madam DiMeo for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Hadi.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the asks of the United Nations have been repeated by the Secretary General and UN principals time and again since 7th of October. 1, a ceasefire. 2, the ability to provide aid to the Palestinians in Gaza in line with the humanitarian principles. 3, an immediate and unconditional release of hostages. The asks are neither new nor impossible. Allow me to begin by sharing some voices from Gaza. In my shelter, I hear women cry all night for help. We wake up every day just to search for food and water. As a mother, I am forced to witness my child starve and cry all night long. We want the war to stop and dream of the day we can go back to our homes in the north. I went 4 months without taking a shower. We have to cut our hair due to lice and lack of shampoo and hygiene material. These are just some of the things that women told me when I met them in Deir el-Balah in Gaza on 9th of July. All of them spoke about lack of safety, dignity, privacy in overcrowded camps. Many women said that they had suicidal thoughts. And their deep suffering, especially as parents, is that they cannot protect their children. And that is the duty of all parents to their children. Thousands of these children have sustained horrific injuries, such as third-degree burns, amputated limbs, and profound mental trauma. Sadly, many of the amputations would not have been necessary if adequate medical care had been available. The children who die often do so slowly and painfully. The ones who survive will have long life disabilities and sad futures. 625,000 children have been deprived from an entire school year of education. Needless to say that a child without an education is a child without future. Children wander around IDP sites 24/7, often unaccompanied, exposed to huge risks and further injuries from playing in rubbles filled with unexploded ordnance. They are also at risk of contracting dangerous diseases such as polio from mountains of garbage and rivers of sewage that flow through IDP settlements. Mr. President, everyone in Gaza is exposed to risks of injury and disease. Those who survive the bombs and the bullets still face the threat of hunger, unsanitary conditions, and lack of health care. People with existing medical conditions, such as cancer, kidney failure, or diabetes, are not getting the treatment they need. And more than tens of thousands of patients require immediate medivacs. Mr. President, the overcrowding of IDP sites has increased community tension and violence, including gender-based violence. As a result of the war, there is no public order anymore. What public order can we expect from 2 million people who are constantly forced to move around a devastated strip of narrow land during heavy fighting? And without public order, there will never be accountability and protection. Protection is urgently needed for the civilian population in Gaza, but also for the humanitarian operations. Humanitarian staff and assets must be protected from all forms of violent attacks. Mr. President, among the destruction of social fabric and infrastructure, the UN and NGOs are sparing no effort to provide life-saving assistance to most vulnerable. We know what needs to be done to aid the people in Gaza, but there is a gulf between what should be done and what humanitarians can do. The commitment or willingness of the aid workers is not an issue. It's the inability to achieve the mandate, and that is beyond our control. My predecessors and colleagues early in this conflict warned about the lack of an enabling environment. Almost 10 months into this crisis, a safe enabling environment for the provision of humanitarian assistance still does not exist in Gaza. As one of my colleagues put it, it's as if our kneecaps were smashed, yet they told us to jump. UNRWA has been shouldering the burden of the crisis. The campaign against UNRWA, attacks against its premises, and the legislative efforts to declare UNRWA as a terrorist organization to end its operations is utterly unacceptable and endangers our operation. As the Secretary General said before, UNRWA is the backbone of our operations in Palestine. Mr. President, today the UN is not in a position to provide the necessary assistance to the people in Gaza, let alone to scale up, unless specific factors are in place. The enabling factors required for humanitarian operations are not new. First and foremost, we need protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, including protection of all humanitarian staff and assets. It is the responsibility of the warring parties to protect humanitarian actors. Duty of care of all humanitarian staff is one of our biggest concerns. Today, the risks inside Gaza are unacceptable. To mitigate these risks, we need systems and equipments, among other things. Second, The unhindered and safe reception, dispatch, and delivery of all humanitarian assistance must be immediately ensured. Current procedures in place for getting aid and fuel consignments from crossings to people in need are cumbersome, dangerous, and costly. All crossings must be utilized simultaneously with streamlined procedures, including Rafah crossing. Rafah must also be reopened for the medical evacuation of patients and the movement of people, humanitarian workers, goods, and fuel. In order to expedite the delivery of aid, we have been asking that our trucks are allowed to drive directly from Egypt and Jordan to the humanitarian destinations inside Gaza. Aid should not wait. We have also repeatedly asked for all checkpoints within Gaza to be opened simultaneously to enable movement from the north to the south and vice versa. Third, there should be no limitations on the amount and type of humanitarian items that can go inside Gaza. Today, we're still struggling to bring in certain medical devices and supplies, plus spare parts to repair civilian infrastructure. Fourth, without visas for all UN staffers and NGOs, workers won't be able to carry out their duties. The list of prerequisites is long. Humanitarian aid alone cannot sustain a population that lacks all basic services and utilities, especially not under the prevailing conditions in Gaza. Whatever shape the conflict may take in the near future, humanitarians must be able to safely access populations in need wherever they are in Gaza and throughout the Strip. In closing, Mr. President, I would like to reiterate that the United Nations and our partners in Gaza will never give up. We will continue to provide desperately needed assistance, but we will need a safe, enabling environment to do so. The human impact of this conflict cannot be overstated. The impact will haunt us, all of us, not for years, but for generations to come. We need a ceasefire, the ability to deliver aid to the Palestinians in Gaza in line with the humanitarian principles, and an immediate and unconditional release of hostages. And all parties must fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law. This includes protection of civilians, ensuring their basic needs are met, allowing them to leave for safer areas, and allowing them to return as soon as circumstances allow. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Hadi for your briefing. Now I will make a statement in my capacity as representative of the Russian Federation.
We would like to thank the Deputy Commissioner General of UNRWA, Ms. Antonia Marie de Meo, and the Humanitarian Coordinator in the occupied Palestinian territory, Mr. Mohamed Handi. We thank them for detailed briefings and the objective assessment of the situation on the ground. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip continues catastrophic. After 300 days, one of the most densely areas in the world, out of that basically nothing remains, and the number of civilian victims is staggering. Almost 40,000 people killed and more than 90,000 wounded, two-thirds of them women and children. More than 50,000 bombs were dropped on the enclave. The housing stock is destroyed, as well as the civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools. The people in Gaza basically have no food, water, or medicine, to say nothing about basic hygiene. Wastewater is flooding the streets. There's rubble everywhere and unexploded ordnance. Those who survived the bombings and shellings have to continuously move around Gaza looking for shelter and safety. Some Palestinians, including those who have children, are changing their place of shelter for the 10th time. And once again, they end up under Israeli shelling because there are no safe places in Gaza left. Eyewitnesses of this, UN staff and humanitarians, all as one confirm this. And many of them confess that in their entire lives they haven't seen such horror, such suffering that an entire people is facing. And so far, unfortunately, there is no hope that these sufferings will end in the near future. Worse than that, one American reporter who spent a month in Gaza saw even that their snipers targeting children specifically. This is what you get from rhetoric stating that every Palestinian as of 3 years of age is a terrorist already. And this is something that we heard from some Israeli ministers at the initial stages of the conflict. Nor are we filled with optimism from the recent data from Han Yunis about those who died, wounded, and yet another evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people. There is a continued great risk of the confrontation spreading to beyond this strip to Lebanon and Syria. Other groups are becoming involved in the confrontation. The Houthis, for example, who delivered such a serious strike into Tel Aviv on the 19th July. We're also concerned of the fact that there is a low level of humanitarian response, and we probably shouldn't have expected anything else in the absence of a ceasefire. As a result of that, all of the humanitarian resolutions of the Council remain word on paper. The special mechanism on humanitarian supplies created under Security Council Resolution 2070-20 obviously is not bringing in any significant outcomes. The attempt to have a corridor between Cyprus and the floating pier has failed. The pier was designed for river conditions and it was simply washed out into the sea. The Rafah crossing, through which significant volumes of humanitarian supply used to be delivered, is closed. The roads through which supplies are to be delivered are destroyed. As far as we can tell, the Israeli authorities continue impeding humanitarian supplies. There is insufficient financing, and people who are locked in Gaza can only hope for external assistance because there is no manufacturing in the Gaza anymore, nor is there agriculture. The deconflicting and the proverbial notifications in the course of active hostilities are clearly not working either. And that's why we get such tragic high figures. 278 humanitarians died. Out of them, 197 used to be UNRWA staff. On the 21st of July, yet another humanitarian convoy into Gaza was shelled. And that's just the humanitarians. The victims are also to be counted amongst the reported. 170 died. The healthcare workers, 500 people. It is the time to sound the alarm bell and to do it regularly. That's why it's difficult for us to understand why some of the Western colleagues on the Council are bashfully sidestepping what is happening in Gaza and prefer convening meetings on other much less urgent topics. And this is not something that does do them honor at all. What is also at an impasse is an attempt to arrive at a settlement because of the disregard or insufficient attention to the interest of one of the conflicting parties. The Biden plan remains on paper, and we warned about that during voting on Resolution 2735. It became a spoiler of a kind and allows Israel, the United States, to contain any attempts by the Security Council members to raise another issues of another outcome of the Council, which would demand an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. We also very concerned by a continued disinformation campaign about UNRWA. As far as we understand, the most disreputable allegations by Israel about UNRWA staff were not confirmed, whereas the conclusions by the group of experts headed by Ms. Colonna confirmed that UNRWA is in line with the principle of neutrality and plays a key role in providing assistance to the Palestinians. Members of the Security Council should not play along with the attempts to discredit the agency. We call upon everyone to rise up in its defense. There is no alternative to UNRWA, and this understanding should be the starting point of the Council's efforts. Draft Knesset resolution aiming to ban UNRWA in West Jerusalem and acknowledging the agency as a terrorist organization can only be interpreted as a slap delivered to the entire United Nations. We call on Israeli authorities to uphold the norms of international humanitarian law and to bear full responsibility for the people under occupation. I refer to, first of all, to the obligations to ensure food supply, health care, and public law and order. What is also needs to happen is the halt to the settlements on the occupied Palestinian territory. It is an egregious violation of international law. It is because of such actions by the Israeli authorities we notice that recently there's been an intensification. The situation in the West Bank, it's now nearing an explosion point. We have stated on several occasions at the same time that we're against violence and terrorism in all of its manifestations, against attacks against peaceful civilians any place, in any country. This applies also, of course, to attacks on Israel on the 7th of October 2023, which we unconditionally and immediately condemned. There is no justification for this. But what is happening in Gaza can only be called a collective punishment and an attempt to totally eliminate the civilian population. Israel, of course, does have the right to ensure its security, but the path towards that goal, with any doubt, is only through a comprehensive Middle East settlement, and first and foremost, through rectifying historic injustice against Palestine, and through creating an independent Palestinian state in line with Security Council and General Assembly decisions. Any other questionable mechanism to reconcile Israel with its neighbors without a just resolution of the Palestinian issue will not bring us to this goal and can only provoke outbursts of violence similar to what the region is living through now. Distinguished colleagues, what we need to do now is pool our efforts in support of just Israeli-Palestinian settlement on the basis of the international legal basis endorsed by the Council, and ensuring that would finally improve the situation in the region. There should be no monopolization of the mediation efforts, which we have been seeing recently in U.S. action, nor should it be a competition amongst main actors. All aspects is important. All effort in the initiative is of import. And in this context, we welcome what was arrived at recently in the Chinese capital, the understanding that is between the representative of Fatah and Hamas, which crowned a whole slew of preparatory meetings, including in Moscow. Palestinian Union is a guarantee that the interests of the Palestinian people will not be ignored once again. We expect that this success will have a positive impact on the ongoing negotiations on the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, which should finally lead to the ceasefire the people of Gaza need so much. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my gratitude to Antonia Marie de Mieu and Mohammed Hadi for their courageous accounts of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. Their words have not only informed us, they have shaken us to our core. Russia, China, and my own country, Algeria, called for this meeting to highlight the urgent need to unite and to coordinate our response to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Our meeting today signals hope that we can set aside our differences and unite in our shared humanity. But hope alone is not enough. The people of Gaza need more than our sympathy, more than our compassion. They need our decisive action. In Gaza, children cry out in hunger. Hospitals overflow with wounded and dying. And families huddle in the rubble of what was once their homes. No, it's not a distant tragedy. It is a catastrophe happening in real time. On our watch, challenging the very essence of our humanity. And we cannot turn away. We cannot remain silent, and we must not fail to act. The eyes of history are upon us, and the voices of Gaza's suffering people echo in this very chamber, asking us one simple question. If not the Security Council, who? If not now, when? Mr. President, today, 96% of Palestinian children and women face food insecurity in Gaza. The images of Palestinian children queuing to get something to eat or eating tree leaves should question our humanity and push us to act. The world watches. History judges. Let our voices thunder and our deed resound. No one more day shall pass with starvation used as a tool of war in Gaza. No one more day. And meanwhile, our council is still discussing the number of trucks entering in Gaza, debating the obstacle deliberately put by the occupying power. Today, we face again challenges related to access and distribution of food. But both are the result of a deliberate Israeli policy. According to OCHA, during the first 2 weeks of July, only 86 trucks entered Gaza per day. This is clearly below the level required. This is clearly below the 500 trucks entering Gaza every day last year. Due to the lack of order and security, humanitarian actors are facing enormous challenge into delivering aid within Gaza to the civilian Palestinian population. And we are talking about human beings. We are talking about lives. We are talking about children who have their own dreams now destroyed by the barbaric Israeli occupying power. Let us be clear. We refute any attempt to absolve the occupying power or shift the responsibility for this disaster to the UN or to the humanitarian actors. The responsibility should be shouldered by the occupying power, which now targets blue helmets, which now target UNRWA. Yes, targeting and handcuffing UNRWA, the only humanitarian agency to capably distribute aid, is also another part of Israeli policy. and any attempt to discredit UNRWA undermines the principle of international cooperation and solidarity and should be opposed by the Security Council. Furthermore, the World Health Organization report of July 16, last week, is very alarming. Polio virus lurks in Gaza sewage, another silent threat poised to explode. This deadly virus now stalks a population already brought to its knees. Their health system is demolished. In the rubble of hospitals and clinics, a new epidemic looms. This is not just a crisis. This is an absolute catastrophe. We cannot ignore the WHO warnings about disease outbreaks among displaced population. Overcrowding, poor hygiene, and lack of water and sanitation in shelters create breeding ground for hepatitis A and other epidemics. These preventable diseases will claim more lives due to shortage of essential medical equipment and justly restricted under dual-use pretexts. Urgent action is needed to address these critical health risks. Israeli brutal tactics are nothing short of collective punishment. Collective punishment, a heinous war crime. As the occupying force, Israel bears full responsibility for the immense suffering and countless innocent Palestinian lives lost. This reign of terror must end. The world can no longer stand silent in the face of such unspeakable cruelty. Mr. President, to address the dire humanitarian situation, Algeria calls for the following action to be taken. First, opening all crossing borders, including Rafah, and it should be operated exclusively by Egypt and the Palestinian Authority. Second, implementing Resolution 2720 by deploying monitors in Rafah to ensure the smooth access of humanitarian aid. Third, enabling UNRWA and other humanitarian actors to distribute humanitarian aid throughout the Gaza Strip, including the north of the territory. Fourth, launching a massive vaccination campaign by WHO to prevent the spread of polio among children. Children are innocent lives that should be protected by everyone. Fifth, ceasefire. Yes, without a ceasefire, all the above measures will be useless. Only a ceasefire in Gaza will allow for effective humanitarian action. Colleagues, the wounds inflicted on Gaza today will scar the world for generations to come. Our children, the future leaders, the future thinkers and citizens of the globe are watching us with eyes wide open. They see how we respond to the crisis of Palestinian children, to the tears of mothers, to the anguish of people pushed to the brink of existence. Our actions shape their understanding of justice, of compassion, and the value of human life. In this critical moment, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice stands as a beacon of hope and a step towards a sustainable solution of the crisis in the Middle East. The ICJ's crystal clear ruling declared Israel occupation illegal, and the settlement activities a violation of the international law. Those who believe in the international order should work to implement this judgment. It's not only a legal document, it is a moral compass pointing us toward a world where international law protects the vulnerable and hold the powerful to account. But make no mistake, if we fail to heed this call, if we allow the suffering in Gaza to continue, we are planting seeds of bitterness and despair that will bear terrible fruits. The only path to end this horrific tragedy is crystal clear. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune boldly proclaims, we must secure the Palestinian people's inalienable right to their own independent state, with Al-Quds Sharif as its rightful capital. It is a moral imperative, a historic debt that humanity must urgently repay. The price of our failure will be paid not just in geopolitics, but also in human lives and shattered dreams. Let's work together to establish a Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. This is the only path to peace and stability in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank Algeria for their statement and now give the floor to China.
Thank you, President. I thank Deputy Commissioner General De Meo and Deputy Special Coordinator Mohamed Hadi for their briefings. The conflict in Gaza has been going on for over 9 months, causing an unprecedented, ever-worsening humanitarian catastrophe, with nearly 40,000 innocent civilians' lives lost. The red lines of international law and international humanitarian law have been crossed repeatedly. The unfolding tragedy in Gaza is testing the moral conscience of humanity and rocking the very foundation of international justice. It will be remembered as a stain in human history, one that is hard to scrub off. We cannot help but ask, how many more lives must be lost? How many more women and children must die? And how many more homes must be destroyed before this tragedy can cease, before the flames of war in Gaza can die down? It has been almost 2 months since Security Council Resolution 2735 was adopted, while certain countries keep asserting that negotiations for a ceasefire are underway. Israel has continued its large-scale military operations over the past 2 months, from Rafah to Khan Yunis, from IDP camps to hospitals, from UN schools to the quote-unquote safe zones designated by Israel. The bombings and attacks have not stopped even for a moment, and innocent civilians are dying each and every single day. Civilian lives must not be used as a bargaining chip for negotiations, and military offensives cannot create the conditions for the release of hostages. Negotiations mustn't go on indefinitely. There isn't a moment to lose when lives are at stake. And alleviating the humanitarian catastrophe allows no delay. We urge Israel to immediately cease all military operations in Gaza. And we urge the United States to put greater pressure on Israel to help bring about an immediate ceasefire. China supports the Council in taking further actions that are necessary to push for the implementation of the relevant resolutions. China reiterates that humanitarian issues mustn't be politicized and that starvation mustn't be turned into a weapon of war. The UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, operating under the GA mandate, is the mainstay of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. China is firmly opposed to attempts to attack and discredit UNRWA and to throw a spanner in the works of UNRWA's mandate implementation. In an alarming development, an UNRWA humanitarian transport vehicle was recently shot at by Israeli forces. The safety and security of humanitarian workers must be ensured, and the incident in question must be thoroughly investigated and those responsible held accountable. China urges Israel to genuinely fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian law by opening all land crossings to give rapid access to humanitarian deliveries at scale and provide security and other required assistance to humanitarian agencies. China reiterates that the implementation of the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Settlement activities in Jordan, in the West Bank, violate international law and relevant Security Council resolutions and chip away at the foundation of the two-state solution, which we firmly oppose. All settlement activities must be halted, and the ever-worsening settler violence must be effectively curbed. China has always been a staunch supporter of the restoration of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people as a nation. Earlier this week, the intra-Palestinian groups held a reconciliation dialogue in Beijing and reached an important consensus, which is a significant step forward towards operationalizing the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine and preparing for post-war governance in Gaza. China firmly supports independent Palestinian statehood and calls for a broader-based, more authoritative and more effective international peace conference to work out a timetable and a roadmap for the implementation of the two-state solution with a view to putting the Palestinian question back on the right track towards a political settlement. President, the negative spillover effects of the Gaza conflict are spreading, echoed by other conflicts at multiple points in the region, and the situation between Lebanon and Israel and the developments in the Red Sea are troubling. Allowing the flames of war and the instability to spread even further would only lead to a catastrophe that engulfs the entire region. China calls on all parties concerned to exercise calm and restraint and to refrain from any action that would exacerbate the tensions. China is ready to work with the rest of the international community in a tireless effort to bring an early end to the war in Gaza, mitigate the impact of the havoc, and help the two-state solution become a reality so that Palestine and Israel can live alongside each other in peace, and durable peace and stability can prevail in the Middle East. I thank you, President.
I thank China for their statement, and I'll give the floor to Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the Deputy General Commissioner De Meo and Deputy Special Coordinator Hadi for their briefings on the humanitarian situation in Gaza and for their invaluable and selfless work. As a consequence of over 9 months of war, almost 200 staff members of UNRWA have died. I would like to reiterate, Madam De Meo, the condolences of my country to the families and victims and support for the work of your organization, which is of crucial importance to ease the situation of the civilian population in Gaza and other areas of the Middle East. This is why I'd like to reiterate the appeal to all those who can do so to continue contribute to financing its operations. This continuity is a factor of stability in the region. Colleagues, the Security Council today heard once again briefings that offer information on strikes on civilian areas, of more deaths, more wounded, and more displaced. We've been informed about further attacks against humanitarian convoys, of the disastrous sanitary situation, and the inexorable deterioration of living conditions for the population of Gaza. At the same time, at least 120 hostages continue in captivity since the terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October of 2023. Which Ecuador condemns once again. These hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Ultimately, the situation has not improved in spite of the efforts of various actors and the demands of this council in Resolution 2735. An agreement has not been reached that allows for the cessation of hostilities, the release of hostages, and delivery of assistance to the civilian population. In the face of this situation, I want to recall once again that the implementation of all resolutions of this council is necessary and is incumbent, as well as respect for the norms of international humanitarian law. Their violation implies severe responsibility. The civilian population and humanitarian personnel cannot and should not be targets and should be protected. There's no justification to attack them or to not respect the principles of necessity, proportionality, and distinction. Also, I would like to reiterate the appeal that I made last week to the parties to demonstrate political will and flexibility to conclude an agreement that makes it possible to stop the violence and take the path of peaceful coexistence between the peoples of Israel and Palestine. And I conclude my intervention, Mr. President, by reiterating the commitment of my country to achieve a peaceful solution that is negotiated, definitive, and just for the parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and the relevant resolutions. Thank you very much.
I thank Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Russia Federation, Algeria, and China for calling this meeting on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We are also grateful to Ms. Antonia Marie De Meo, Deputy Commissioner General of UNRWA for operational support, and to Mr. Muhannad Hadi, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, for their briefings on the matter. Mr. President, the adoption of Resolution 2720 marked a significant step towards protecting civilians and enabling immediate humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in dire need. However, we are deeply concerned that the objectives laid out in this resolution remain unfulfilled as the conflict in Gaza continues to escalate, causing unprecedented civilian casualties, mass displacement, and a severe humanitarian crisis. We strongly condemn the ongoing Israeli air, land, and sea attacks across the Gaza Strip, resulting in additional civilian casualties, displacement, and destruction of home and critical civilian infrastructure. Such actions blatantly violate international law, the international human rights law, and the international humanitarian principles. On the other hand, the forced evacuation orders on the population to leave certain areas and persistent hostilities have deprived Palestinians of basic goods and services, including health care, water, food, fuel, commercial supplies, and electricity. Moreover, we condemn the continued attacks by Israel armed forces on UN humanitarian convoys. As a result of these attacks, the safety of humanitarian aid workers remains at grave risk, with reports indicating the death of at least 278 workers, including 201 United Nations staff in their line of duty since October 2023. Mr. President, there is no plausible reason for the current unjustified and unbearable suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. The humanitarian disaster in Gaza must cease, and to this end, the war has to come to a halt immediately. We demand the immediate and full implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, 2724, and 2735. Furthermore, we urge Israel to comply with the International Court of Justice rulings calling for an immediate ceasefire. It is imperative that Israel allows unhindered humanitarian assistance, including provision of necessary basic goods and services to flow into Gaza. The opening of all border crossings, particularly Rafah, is critical in order to allow rapid and unrestricted entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. We also call upon the international community to provide full support to UNRWA, as it is a pillar of regional stability and a lifeline of hope for millions of Palestinian refugees. We therefore call on donors to provide the agency with the necessary and predictable financial resources to operate and fulfill its mandate. In conclusion, Mr. President, we reiterate our unwavering support to the need for the implementation of the two-state solutions, envisioning two independent and sovereign states, Israel and Palestine, coexisting peacefully as members of the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for your statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Antonia Marie Di Meo, Deputy Commissioner General for Operational Support of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, and Mr. Muhannad Hadi, Deputy Special Coordinator, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for their comprehensive briefings. We welcome the presence of the representatives of the State of Palestine, Israel, and Iraq in this meeting. On the 17th of July 2024, during the briefing in this Council on the situation in the Middle East Palestine question, the Chef de Cabinet, in delivering the Secretary General's statement, informed this Council that, quote, the humanitarian support system in Gaza is close to total collapse, while Israel continues to intensify its military operation in the Gaza Strip, coupled with complete breakdown of public order. End of quote. Slightly over a week, reports outline that the situation remains dire and chaotic, with continuing sustained military operation exacerbating an already desperate humanitarian crisis. About 274 humanitarian personnel, including 197 from UNRWA have lost their lives since the 7th October 2023. We are still alarmed by reports of new evacuation orders from the Israeli security forces that demand the immediate transfer of civilians from areas initially considered to be quote-unquote humanitarian safe zones in the Al-Mawasi area of Khan Yunis, among others. These actions do not only contravene the provisions of international humanitarian law, but they create psychological distress for those affected, including but not limited to long-term fear, anxiety, and trauma. The attacks on UN convoys and humanitarian workers is a violation of international humanitarian law and hinders the ability of humanitarian agencies to deliver critical assistance to civilians in desperate need. On this note, we condemn the recent attacks on UNRWA and UNICEF convoys, the latter carrying 5 Palestinian children, including a baby, to be reunited with their father. Mass displacement and overcrowding in camps is creating a desperation for food, shelter, and medical aid, as resources and the existing fragile infrastructure are stretched to breaking point. The healthcare system continues to be affected by reduced service availability, as its operational capacity is affected by hostilities, continuous evacuation orders, damaged infrastructure, fuel shortage, and other essential medical supplies. Women and children remain gravely impacted, as an estimated 30,000 pregnant women are facing acute levels of hunger, IPC Phase 3 report. The majority of women lack privacy, which is interfering with their dignity, increasing their exposure to sexual-based violence, rape, and domestic abuse. Access to full and unhindered humanitarian aid remains a challenge, owing to denials and delays by the IDF for coordinated movement, as well as attacks by criminal gangs on humanitarian convoys. The prevailing circumstance is made worse by the fact that only 2 crossings, namely Kerem Abu Salem, Kerem Shalom in the south and Zikim in the north, remains partially operational. Mr. President, the recent International Court of Justice advisory opinions of 19th July 2024 on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and its provisional measures orders in the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel, all point to one direction, which is ending the unlawful occupation, ensure unhindered access to humanitarian aid, and release of the hostages and wrongfully detained prisoners. To achieve all of these, Sierra Leone reiterates the demand for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and the entire occupied Palestinian territory. A ceasefire to improve the security situation in the Gaza Strip curtails lawlessness and social disorder, guarantees the protection of civilians, and facilitates the unhindered passage of humanitarian relief to the millions of people in urgent need. We call for the respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law in all aspects. We emphasize that the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution be applied to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects. This could be enhanced by establishing an effective deconfliction notification mechanism to remove obstacles to humanitarian action and avoid potential hazards for humanitarian personnel. Mr. President, we strongly support the mediation efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the US, and urge both parties to approach the negotiation with good faith and the determination and courage needed for a positive outcome. In the words of the UN Secretary General, there needs to be, quote, surge in diplomacy for peace, which is the best way to, and at the same time, help us to limit suffering, human suffering in all dimensions, end of quote. Let me close, Mr. President, by acknowledging the indispensable role of UNRWA in the current and future humanitarian architecture of Palestinian refugees. UNRWA should be strengthened and not weakened. UNRWA should be funded and not defunded. UNRWA staff should be honored and not killed. I thank you.
Я благодарю.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I give the floor to Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank Mr. Mayo and Resident Humanitarian Coordinator Hadi for their briefings. As we have heard from our briefers, the situation in Gaza is beyond catastrophic. Humanitarian aid continues to be blocked without any legitimate administrative or bureaucratic reasons. Over the past 10 months, the pleas of the people of Gaza, the United Nations, and the countless medical and humanitarian staff who have sought to aid them have gone unanswered by Israel. Alternative attempts at aid delivery via sea and air have failed, and the situation has quickly reverted to the status quo: hopelessness. Today, the man-made humanitarian disaster in Gaza is worse than at any point in the past 10 months. Millions of people face starvation and dehydration. Humanitarian assistance remains politicized. UNRWA continues to be targeted and vilified. No hospital in Gaza remains fully functioning. No university has been left standing. There are no more police, kindergarten teachers, bus drivers, medical specialists, or shopkeepers. The social fabric has been completely torn apart, perhaps irreparably. All that remains are individuals who have lost all sense of hope and purpose, while struggling for their daily survival amid terror, starvation, and criminality. We have heard this morning how Gazans view the UN as complicit in their plight, especially amid the breakdown of law and order. The resolutions this Council has adopted have not been implemented, and this is unacceptable. As a Council, we must redouble our efforts and continue to apply pressure on all parties to comply with their obligations under international law. As things stand, humanitarian organizations remain unable to carry out basic emergency operations. Women in Gaza face severe lack of privacy and security. Instances of rape and sexual violence in inadequate lavatory and sanitation facilities are alarmingly prevalent, and this represents only the tip of the iceberg. It is profoundly concerning that diseases such as polio and diphtheria are re-emerging. Israel has the responsibility to ensure that essential aid convoys and facilities in both the West Bank and Gaza are not unduly delayed or destroyed. The Palestinian people cannot continue to endure the situation, which is effectively akin to hell on earth. President, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice has clearly exposed the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories and must be heeded. All new settlement activities must cease, and existing settlements must be evacuated. These settlements are the root causes of the ongoing violence and the perpetual crisis we see in the region today. The international community must heed this advisory opinion. The survival and credibility of our multilateral system is at stake if we fail to do so. This starts with the implementation of Resolutions 2334, 2712, 2720, and 2735, and the compliance with the provisional orders of the ICJ from January of this year. Nothing less will suffice. Thank you.
Я благодарю Мальту за их заявление.
I thank Malta for their statement. I give the floor to Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I would like to thank the Deputy Commissioner General of UNRWA, Ms. Di Maio, and the Humanitarian Coordinator, Mr. Hadi, for their statements. Switzerland is grateful for the important humanitarian work done by your staff, who risk their lives every day to meet the enormous needs in a highly difficult context. I offer my most sincere condolences to the UN, in particular UNRWA, and to the families of those killed in the line of duty. Mr. President, the Secretary General spoke of a landscape of death and destruction with a degree of chaos that affects every Palestinian and those who seek to help them. He did this when he described the situation in the Gaza Strip. Since the acts of terror committed by Hamas almost 10 months ago, men, women, and children have been living in unacceptable conditions without any protection and subjected to repeated displacements, famine, and incessant hostilities. In addition, the breakdown of law and order is contributing to the lack of security, including for humanitarian workers. Conditions continue to deteriorate, and the situation remains alarming. Switzerland condemns the fact that hostilities continue to claim many victims and displace thousands of civilians, as happened last Monday in the Han Yunis refugee camp. Switzerland condemns all violations of international humanitarian law, including indiscriminate attacks and violence against civilians, against non-combatants, and civilian objects, as well as human rights violations and abuses. These violations must stop immediately, and those responsible must be held accountable. In Resolution 2730, this Council reaffirmed the responsibility of states and parties to the conflict to respect and protect the civilian population, including humanitarian personnel, and it is high time that these obligations were abided by. There is an urgent need to restore immediate, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access to the entire affected population at all crossing points and throughout the Gaza Strip. This also applies to UNRWA, the largest humanitarian actor in the Gaza Strip. Incidents in which clearly identified UN vehicles are fired upon must cease. Furthermore, Switzerland condemns the continued use of inflammatory language, despite our repeated appeals to abandon it. In this already extremely volatile environment, such language is likely to endanger the safety of UN operators, as well as the lives of employees working to help the civilian population. In view of these observations, we would like to reiterate these three main messages. First, and once again, Switzerland calls on the parties to strictly abide by the international humanitarian law. Attacks on the civilian population, including humanitarian and medical personnel, and the deliberate use of starvation as a method of war are war crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Respect for and the implementation of international humanitarian law and human rights, in particular the protection of civilians, must remain a priority for this Council. Second, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. Thirdly, we demand the full implementation of the binding decisions of this Council, in particular Resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. An immediate and lasting ceasefire is essential to improve the situation of the civilian population. Mr. President, these elements are only the first steps towards a political resolution of the conflict. We call on the members of this Council and the states that can exert influence on the parties to the conflict to take the necessary measures to put an end to the violence and to relaunch a process of dialogue with a view to implementing the two-state solution. I thank you. I thank Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to Slovenia.
Much, Mr. President. I also want to thank the two briefers, Ms. Di Maio and Mr. Hadi, for their very clear messages. From the beginning of the war, UNRWA has been the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza. We are therefore particularly pleased that together with a large majority of the UN member states, all current and incoming incoming Council members have joined the shared commitments on UNRWA, reaffirming the vital role of the agency. While serving people on the ground, UNRWA has been facing continuous challenges. Among many, as we heard today, the alarming legislative proposals in the Knesset, as well as decisions to replace UNRWA and services in East Jerusalem. UNRWA has also paid one of the highest prices in Gaza, with 199 staff members killed, and a high number of its installations damaged or completely destroyed. This includes the main UNRWA compound in Gaza. UNRWA facilities that were supposed to serve as designated shelters in times of conflict have turned into death traps for hundreds of displaced persons. We echo the call of Commissioner General that irrespective of the perpetrator, there must be accountability for every blatant disregard of international humanitarian law. Colleagues, we have repeated many times our concern over the situation of groups in vulnerable situations, including children, women, older persons, and others. Today, I would like to especially underline the need to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities. As we mark the 5th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 2475, we are appalled by the circumstances in which persons with disabilities are living in Gaza. Profound physical distress, trauma, destruction of hospitals, lack of access to medical care, lack of psychosocial support, lack of access to sanitation, and lack of access to assistive devices, many times due to dual-use restrictions. Colleagues, Gaza is twice the size of Washington, D.C. It has been bombed over and over again for 10 months. There is probably nothing left there but a pile of rubble, the pile that continues to be bombed. On this small part of land, 2 million people are being chased from one corner to the other. They never know if they will reach the other corner fast enough to stay alive. What are we, the Council, doing? This is a question that we are getting from our citizens. We've had numerous briefings on humanitarian situation, on hunger, on amputations without anesthesia, on attacks on humanitarian and medical personnel. We adopted 4 resolutions, established a mechanism for humanitarian aid, called for a ceasefire and the release of hostages. But the nature of the briefings has not changed. We have been waiting for ceasefire negotiations to finalize and bring peace. For months, we have been waiting, supposedly getting closer and closer, but never close enough to end the suffering. Meanwhile, we let Rafah happen. My response to people in Slovenia was that we don't have power to enforce a ceasefire. As a member of the Council, we see our role as sending messages or offering proposals, putting pressure on other members, on those who can influence, on parties to act. But is it enough? I'm convinced we are all asking ourselves, are we doing enough to end the suffering of civilians in Gaza? I listened carefully to our statements on Gaza. Over months, our frustration about the lack of progress grew, and so did emotions in our speeches. The situation should not make us tired, frustrated, or helpless. As Mr. Hadi said today, we shall never give up. Martin Griffiths used to say, we continue to try. Indeed, we should continue to try. That's why we were elected to the Council. That's why we have meetings like today. History is the harshest critic of inaction, and history has been written as we sit here today. Colleagues, maybe we differ in nuances where the fault for not ending the suffering is, but we all share concern for the suffering of civilians. Maybe this is a good enough starting point, putting Gazans and hostages in the center of our efforts. For us, this would translate into the following actions of the Council, into the following fine-tuning of the Resolution 2735. 1, to demand from Israel and Hamas the finalization of a ceasefire deal with a short deadline. 2, to demand a pause in fighting while the ceasefire deal is being finalized, an Olympic truce, if you want. And 3, and after the grace period, if a ceasefire deal is still not in place, we should take further action to make Hamas and Israel comply. In addition, we believe it is time to start reflecting on the time beyond the ceasefire, to reflect how to support transitional governance in Gaza, on security arrangements, on bringing back normality to Gaza, to children there, if that is at all possible, on reconstruction, as well as on the final resolution of the conflict for two peoples and two states. This is what we believe the Council could do to move beyond briefings and beyond lamenting over the humanitarian situation. We are ready to engage. Again, we should start by putting civilians at the center of our action. Thank you.
I thank Slovenia for their statement, and I'll give the floor to the United States.
Thank you. And thank you, Deputy Commissioner General De Mayo and Deputy Special Coordinator Hadi, for the continued work of your teams to alleviate the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. The confirmation of vaccine-derived poliovirus in Gaza is worrisome and underscores the need for urgent action to address the significant and growing health risks to the population of Gaza. The fighting has brought Gaza's health system to the brink of collapse and complicated the international community's ability to respond to outbreaks. It has also led to the failure of waste management systems and the critical infrastructure required to provide for the basic needs of Palestinians. Meanwhile, poor nutrition and interrupted routine immunizations have significantly heightened the health risks to the population and further undermine their ability to combat the spread of infectious diseases. Colleagues, these and other humanitarian challenges will only intensify absent a conclusion of the ceasefire deal called for in Resolution 2735. During his meeting yesterday with Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Biden expressed the need to close the remaining gaps and finalize the deal as soon as possible to bring all of the hostages home and reach a durable end to the war in Gaza. It is vital that the Security Council maintain pressure on Hamas to reach a final agreement and begin implementation without delay or further conditions. The President also raised the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the need to remove obstacles to the flow of aid and to restore basic services for those in need, and the critical importance of protecting civilian lives during military operations. Indeed, a ceasefire would enable us to surge humanitarian assistance, begin to restore basic services such as electricity and sanitation, and enable Palestinian civilians to begin returning to their homes. A ceasefire would also create a safer and more conducive environment for health workers to carry out needed immunization campaigns and provide other health interventions. Colleagues, we've been clear that all parties to the conflict must do more to protect aid workers trying to deliver desperately needed help to civilians. We have called on Israel to investigate incidents where humanitarian workers have been killed or injured, to hold anyone found responsible for misconduct accountable, and to take steps to prevent such incidents from recurring. The United States has long been opposed to any actions that undermine their personal safety and/or ability of UN personnel to carry out their mission, whether in Gaza or any other conflict zone in the world. That includes the personnel of all UN agencies. Heated rhetoric and attacks aimed at UN organizations such as UNRWA, as well as UN personnel performing humanitarian functions, put the safety of all UN and humanitarian aid workers at risk. They do nothing to get humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. We also reiterate our call for the UN to investigate all credible claims of UN personnel that might be affiliated with or involved in acts of terrorism. It is vital that ongoing investigations are concluded swiftly and that UN organizations, including UNRWA, implement recommended reforms. In the same spirit, we encourage Israel to work with the UN to establish a system for the smooth and regular exchange and analysis of information regarding any staff suspected to belong to a terrorist group. Even as we press all parties to facilitate life-saving work, we must not ignore how Hamas's actions continue to put civilians, including humanitarian personnel and their families, at risk. And as we have long argued, Hamas could begin to end the suffering in Gaza tomorrow if it immediately accepted and agreed to implement, without delay or further conditions, the ceasefire agreement on the table, which the Security Council called for it to accept more than a month ago. With a ceasefire in place, efforts to restore basic services, including electricity, water, and sanitation, could be accelerated and bring much-needed relief to the Palestinian people. It would also enable the movement of Palestinian civilians out of al-Mawasi, alleviating the catastrophic humanitarian situation that has developed in the south. Implementation of the ceasefire deal would also facilitate the release of all hostages held by Hamas. These hostages have been held for nearly 300 days and have never been visited by a humanitarian agency. Among them are 8 Americans and citizens from many other countries. The United States is committed to doing everything possible to bring these hostages home, to reunite loved ones with their families. We are committed to working to close gaps at the negotiating table, to improve sustained humanitarian access at scale, and to continue working toward a two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians alike can live in peace and with dignity. Colleagues, in closing, I must address another Russian attempt to play politics with the tragic situation in Gaza. The Chinese permanent representative said in his statement the need to avoid politicizing the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I agree completely. Russia continues to try to portray itself as a great humanitarian actor when it comes to Gaza, yet it does very little when it comes to trying to address the humanitarian situation. Nothing in the Russian permanent representative's statement referenced anything about what it's doing to help relieve the humanitarian situation. Let's not forget the humanitarian disaster it has created in Ukraine. As I've said many times, Russia doesn't help solve humanitarian crises, it creates them. So I call on the Russian representative to heed the call of his Chinese counterpart and stop playing politics with the situation in Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you.
I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to start by thanking Deputy Commissioner General De Maio and Deputy Special Coordinator Hardy for their briefings. President, on his recent visit to the region, my Foreign Secretary met Israelis and Palestinians and heard their stories of suffering, pain, and anguish. He came away determined to help improve the situation and further convinced that there is no military solution to this conflict. That is why we're calling for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate release of all hostages, and an immediate scale-up of aid into Gaza. We urge both sides to accept the deal on the table endorsed by this Council. President, while mediation efforts continue, people in Gaza urgently need a drastic improvement in the humanitarian situation. First, civilians need better protection and designated civilian spaces. We're deeply concerned by Israel's incursion into Khan Yunis and into the only remaining IDF-designated humanitarian zone of Al-Mawasi, where some 1.5 million people are sheltering. We call on all sides to comply fully with international humanitarian law and on Hamas to release all the hostages immediately. Second, civilians in Gaza need much, much more aid. UNRWA is central to these efforts. That is why we announced $27 million in new funding for UNRWA last week, with some of that earmarked to support the management reforms recommended by the Colonna Review. We call for full cooperation with UN and humanitarian teams, including UNRWA, granting visas, allowing equipment in, and opening all aid routes into Gaza, including reopening the Rafah crossing. Deteriorating law and order must be addressed urgently so that aid can reach people safely. Finally, civilians need functioning hospitals and essential supplies such as water and electricity after 9 months of devastation. We are appalled by the stories of women and children living in unsanitary conditions, and that disease, including polio, is spreading. Colleagues, West Bank settlement expansion and settler violence have reached record levels. The Israeli government has seized more land this year than in the past 20 years combined. This is unacceptable. It runs counter to multiple resolutions of this Council and undermines the viability of a two-state solution. The only way out of this cycle of violence and suffering is through diplomacy, with Israelis and Palestinians committing to a renewed peace process resulting in a two-state solution, with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. We are committed to giving the people of the West Bank and Gaza the political perspective of a credible route to a Palestinian state and a new future, and it needs to be irreversible. I thank you.
I thank the United Kingdom for their statement, and I'll give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Deputy Commissioner General Antonio Di Mio of UNRWA and Deputy Special Coordinator Muhannad Hadi for their sobering briefings. Let's be clear, a ceasefire is the only way, as well as the critical first step to alleviate the immense suffering that has lasted for far too long. This is why the Republic of Korea has repeatedly called for an end to the current conflict in Gaza. Too many people have been killed since the terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th. More changes to the terms of the ceasefire deal will only result in more suffering for Palestinians in Gaza and Israeli hostages. In accordance with Resolution 2735, both parties must immediately finalize and implement the deal, which is the most reliable and realistic path toward an immediate ceasefire. The international community, including this Council, should exert its efforts to support the deal and press the parties to finalize it in order to stop the bloodshed, release hostages, and get aid in at scale. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is deepening further, with even more harrowing challenges to civilian lives now ensuing. 2.3 million people are suffering from repeated evacuation orders and a debilitating lack of humanitarian assistance, as law and order have totally broken down. We reiterate our appeal for the opening of all land crossings and the elimination of any hindrance to the delivery of humanitarian aid. We are particularly worried of the possible outbreak of widespread disease, including polio, as briefer said. Only 16 hospitals are partially functioning in the densely populated area in the midst of an unprecedented food, water, and the sanitation crisis. All measures, including the unhindered provision of enough vaccines, should be implemented to prevent the spreading of infectious disease. We are also alarmed by the repeated IDF attacks on humanitarian workers, including the shooting at a UN convoy on July 21st, and another shooting at a UNICEF convoy on July 23rd. Humanitarian workers, as well as civilians, must be protected under international law. All measures to protect them, including the provision of adequate equipment, must be implemented, and the perpetrators should be held accountable. As many colleagues said, UNRWA is the backbone of humanitarian efforts in Gaza and essential for ensuring the dignified lives of millions of Palestinian refugees in the region. Any attempt to hamper its activities and legitimacy by a national institution of a member state is a dangerous challenge to the architecture of a global governance based on the UN, and thus cannot be tolerated. Mr. President, we take note of the advisory opinion by the ICJ delivered last week. This opinion is all the more significant as the situation in the West Bank deteriorates with ongoing violence by the Israeli security forces and settlers, as well as Palestinian groups, and the surging settlement expansions. Indeed, UNICEF reported this week that one Palestinian child has been killed in the West Bank every 2 days since October. As Resolution 2334 clearly provides, settlement in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, have no legal validity. We call on Israel to cease all settlement activities and respect the rights of the Palestinian people, including the right of self-determination. Colleagues, the entire world is hitting its utmost tension to the Middle East. Amid the ongoing armed presence of various militias in southern Lebanon, notably Hezbollah, inconsistent with Resolution 1701, we are witnessing daily exchange of fires across the blue line, another clear violation of the same resolution. These violations are consistently threatening the lives of civilians as well as UNIFIL personnel, including those of Republic of Korea. In addition, the unjustifiable, reckless drone attack on Tel Aviv by the Houthis, as well as Israel's military response, are troublesome, as both resulted in the loss of civilians' lives. All parties in the region must exercise maximum restraint, and international efforts to enhance de-escalation in the region should be encouraged. The commitment of the international community toward the vision of the two-state solution is strong and steadfast. Any inflammatory rhetoric, whether it is from Israeli politicians or from Hamas members, cannot have any impact on this firm global aspiration. Gaza, the West Bank should be united under a reformed and strengthened Palestinian Authority. Any measures intend to weaken the PA will have negative impacts on the security of Israel by prolonging the long-standing agony, confrontation, and instability, not only in Israel and Palestine, but also in the wider region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank UNRWA Deputy Commissioner General De Meo, President and Humanitarian Coordinator Hadi for their sobering briefings. Nearly 10 months ago, this conflict began with the reprehensible terror attack on Israel by Hamas and other militant groups. Japan once again unequivocally condemned the attack and the taking of hostages, more than 100 of whom are still unable to return to their home. However, since then, the relentless fighting has brought Gaza to a state where life is barely tenable, with too many civilians' deaths and injuries, mostly women and children. Desperate Palestinians are facing acute food insecurity, if not famine, and are left searching for the most basic essentials: safe drinking water, basic sanitation, medical care, and shelter. We are extremely worried by the detection of cholera and polio in Gaza, which poses a grave risk of spreading due to the breakdown of the water and sanitation systems. Furthermore, Israel's repeated evacuation order have forced nearly 1.9 million to relocate, many multiple times. Japan is appalled by the heavy civilian casualties caused by the ongoing hostilities, including the IDF's new military offensive in Han Yunis, which reportedly killed dozens and forced thousands to flee. The reduction in the size of the so-called humanitarian zone in Al-Mawasi is deeply troubling. These recent events demonstrate even more clearly that there is no safe place in Gaza, and we reiterate the urgent need for all parties to strictly abide by international law, including international humanitarian law, especially the protection of civilians. A prompt and extensive delivery of humanitarian aid is essential, yet the Rafah crossing has remained closed since early May. It should be reopened immediately. Japan commends the humanitarian aid workers who are bravely working under dangerous environments, and we call for their safety to be ensured. But the breakdown in public order creates enormous challenges for their life-saving work. The role of UNRWA is vital, and as Secretary General Guterres has stated, nothing can replace it. Yet, since the conflict began, nearly 200 of its staff has been killed, and nearly 200 of its premises have been damaged or destroyed. This is unacceptable. We are also concerned about the number of proposed measures that may disturb UNRWA's activities. The only viable solution to stop this ongoing horror is the three-stage ceasefire proposal endorsed as UN Security Council Resolution 2735. Japan amplifies our call for all parties concerned to steadily work towards the release of all hostages and a sustainable ceasefire, as well as the safe and effective distribution of humanitarian assistance at scale throughout the Gaza. We reiterate our strong support for the painstaking diplomatic efforts led by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar to that end. Once a ceasefire is realized, the international community will have to help rebuild Gaza and restore a political horizon for a two-state solution, which is the only path that can finally bring peace for Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank Japan for their statement, and I'll give the floor to France.
Mr. President, I thank the Deputy Commissioner General of UNRWA and the Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for their briefings. The situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate and has been over the past 10 months. It is urgent to establish a ceasefire to put an end to the suffering of the civilians. Hostages must finally be released. This Security Council has adopted 4 resolutions since the 7th of October of 2023. None of them has been implemented. France supported the proposal made by the United States that was endorsed by this Council on the 10th of June in its resolution 2735. 6 weeks after that vote, it's time for that resolution to finally be implemented. France condemns once again the terrorist attacks committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October 2023. I'd like to dwell on 4 points. First of all, respect for international humanitarian law is incumbent on all. President Macron recalled our opposition to Israeli operations in Han Yunis and Rafah, which only aggravate an already disastrous situation. Israeli strikes that these past few days targeted an UNRWA school and an IDP camp are unacceptable. Famine has taken hold. 80% of civilian infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed, including 100% of educational infrastructure. The long-term consequences on an entire generation of children are catastrophic. Secondly, the effectiveness of aid is an essential point. We call on Israel to allow for unhindered access and through all possible channels. This implies for Israel to ensure passage through land channels, as well as issue all necessary authorizations. The revoking of visas for UN personnel are unacceptable. France supports the work of the special coordinator, Sigrid Kaag. She must also be in a position to start envisioning reconstruction. Thirdly, humanitarian aid must circulate within the Gaza Strip and to be distributed. Incidents that affected United Nations convoys at the beginning of the week are unacceptable. We condemn all obstacles put up by Hamas and other armed groups. We call on all actors to ensure the effectiveness of the mechanisms of deconfliction. Fourthly, protection of humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. France pays tribute to all humanitarian personnel who were killed in Gaza and all those who risked their lives to aid the civilian population. In the face of the immensity of the needs, the role of UNRWA is essential. Its staff should be able to continue to provide aid to the civilians. Impediments must cease. Our support for this year totals 38 million euros, which makes France the fourth largest donor to UNRWA. The reform of UNRWA must continue to ensure its neutrality. Mr. President, France would like to reaffirm the urgency of reaching a lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of the two-state solution, the only one that can bring peace to Israelis and Palestinians and guarantee stability for the region. Putting into question this imperative that has been recognized as such by the immense majority of the international community must cease. France remains mobilized to achieve that, and it will do our utmost to this end, including within this council. I thank you. I thank France for your statement, and I give the floor to Guyana.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking you, along with the delegations of Algeria and China, for requesting this briefing. It is critical for this council to maintain an active and consistent focus on Gaza, as should be the case for every other conflict situation where the level of civilian suffering is of enormous proportions. I also thank Deputy Commissioner General Di Maio and Deputy Special Coordinator Hadi for their sobering briefings. At the outset, Guyana stresses the critical role of UNRWA amidst the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and urges the Council's strong support for the agency as it faces ongoing attacks. We are approaching 300 days of Israel's war on Gaza. For those civilians dwelling in the beleaguered enclave, the days since 7th October 2023 have been characterized by destruction and decimation of an unprecedented magnitude. Humanitarian after humanitarian has emphasized that in many decades of fieldwork, they had never witnessed a crisis of such proportions. The humanitarian principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution continue to be disregarded, despite the obligation to adhere to these important tenets of international humanitarian law. As a result, an extremely dangerous operating environment has been created for humanitarians, exacerbated by the non-functioning of deconfliction and notification mechanisms. Guyana has taken note that the Israeli Defense Force continues its aerial, land, and maritime bombardment across the Gaza Strip. Civilians who have been ordered to evacuate multiple times and relocate to so-called humanitarian safe zones have not been spared these bombardments, since the IDF has not been distinguishing between civilians and legitimate military targets. In fact, we continue to witness a deliberate targeting of schools and shelters housing displaced persons, on the pretext that the IDF is targeting Palestinian fighters. Were the thousands of children killed and maimed in Gaza Palestinian fighters? Were any measures at all taken to spare these little ones from harm? Guyana condemns in the strongest terms the wanton killing of civilians and calls on all parties, including the IDF, to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. Mr. President, Guyana is concerned about the frequent attacks on humanitarian personnel, including those traveling in convoys utilizing clearly marked vehicles. We have too frequently heard the complaint that even though movement coordinates were shared with the Israeli authorities or approval given for passage, convoys have still been shot at, endangering the lives of humanitarians. We condemn these attacks and call on Israel to respect the humanitarian nature of the work that these personnel are undertaking in response to the catastrophic man-made humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Further, there must be accountability for these violations of international law. Guyana has taken note of how the breakdown of law and order in the Gaza Strip has become a prominent factor inhibiting the delivery of aid across Gaza. According to OCHA, this is engendered by desperation stemming from slow and inadequate delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza and is perpetuated by the lack of civil authority created by the unprecedented nature of the war. This could likely create persistent challenges even after a ceasefire is achieved, and Guyana stresses the need for this Council to begin considering how these potential challenges could be staved off. Mr. President, the consequences of this operating environment, which I have hitherto elaborated, were outlined by our briefers today. We also continue to receive media reports and reports from the various UN agencies about the situation on the ground, including details about the deeply inhumane treatment of Palestinian civilians, both in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The report of a confrontation between Palestinian civilians and Israeli security forces in the occupied West Bank, where the former threw stones at the ISF and elicited live ammunition, rubber-coated metal bullets, and tear gas canisters in response, is illustrative of the wider paradigms of this conflict. It is one of defenseless Palestinians pitted against a war machine intent on dispossessing, subjugating, and annihilating them. How do we stop this, Mr. President? I believe the ICJ's advisory opinion of 19 July gives us the answer, an answer we have known all along. Allow me to quote from the opinion, quote, "The precise modalities to bring an end to Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is a matter to be dealt with by the General Assembly, as well as the Security Council. Therefore, it is for the General Assembly and the Security Council to consider what further action is required to put an end to the illegal presence of Israel. The urgent necessity is for the United Nations as a whole to redouble its efforts to bring the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which continues to pose a threat to international peace and security, to a speedy conclusion, thereby establishing a just and lasting peace in the region." End of quote. I am compelled to recall the practice of many displaced Palestinians to hold on to their home keys, signifying the hope of returning to their homeland. This practice is ripe with messaging for this Council, and I want to highlight just three. First, consensus in this Council on the critical matter of mandating the end of Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory is key to ending this decades-long conflict. Second, consensus in this Council on the equally critical matter of enforcing such a mandate is also key to ending this decades-long conflict. And third and final, consensus in this Council is key for the injustice against Palestinians to be remedied. The key, Mr. President, is consensus in this Council. I conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating the urgency of achieving a ceasefire in Gaza, of securing the release of hostages, and of a surge in humanitarian assistance to Palestinians. Guyana also calls for an immediate halt of settlement activities and the accompanying violence in the West Bank. These are the immediate short-term measures needed. The solution, though, is for the collective feet off the back of the Palestinians, paving the way for them to exercise their right to self-determination. Achieving a free and independent state of Palestine is the international community's responsibility, and Guyana remains ever committed to doing its part to this end. I thank you.
I thank Guyana for your statement. As representative of the Russian Federation, I'd like to make an additional statement. The representative of the United States seems to really enjoy what he probably thinks are devastating invectives against Russia. And this time, he even invoked China as an ally, which at a different time, he never tires to ostracize on any pretext, which he considers merits that. And yet we are quite grateful to the representative of the United States for a clear demonstration of how a statement of a state that claims to have to be a responsible international actor, what it should not look like, and more specifically, a self-proclaimed coach of all international actors. If the United States spent for humanitarian aid in Gaza and other regions in need, even a small share of what they spend on supplies of weapons to hot spots, our world would be very different. Billions of dollars are spent for weapons to Israel, including $6.5 billion after the 7th of October, and tens of billions for Ukraine. Weapons which caused the death of thousands of Palestinians and Ukrainians. That is the real contribution of Washington. And if we speak of Gaza, the first thing that comes to mind is the completely pathetic project of the Sea Piers. This is really a masterpiece of kind of showcase architecture, which was basically washed away into the sea. As far as we understand, almost $300 million was spent on that piers. That's approximately the same amount that was declared to be in the form of humanitarian aid to Gaza throughout the whole year, this year, through bilateral channels. But of course, we also recalled containers with assistance that were airdropped, which caused the deaths of tens of Palestinians. All this was done instead of forcing Israel to abide by a ceasefire. Russia does provide humanitarian aid to Palestine through NGOs, through the government, and through the World Food Program. And the Palestinians are well aware of that. And overall, colleagues, just a friendly advice to you. Before giving lessons to everyone, at least pay up your contribution to the United Nations and stop causing a crisis of liquidity which also hinders the humanitarian efforts of our organization. I now go back to my role as president of the Security Council, and I give the floor to the United States for an additional statement.
Colleagues, it's very interesting to hear the Russian Federation kind of belittle the humanitarian contributions that the United States gives around the world. We are one of the leaders, if not the leading single state contributor to humanitarian assistance. I'd be very interested to hear what Russia spends on humanitarian assistance as a percentage of its GDP. The United States is a lead player on humanitarian assistance around the globe. Russia is not. If Russia just spent 1% of what it is spending to carry out barbaric atrocities in Ukraine, then it could make a claim that it was doing something to solve humanitarian crises around the world. So Russia is in no place to criticize the United States for what it does to humanitarian causes around the world. And I will repeat, Russia doesn't help solve humanitarian crises, it creates them. Look in Ukraine. Thank you.
I don't plan to continue this discussion. I'll just say very briefly, as representative of the Russian Federation, I'd like to know what percentage of GDP of the United States is represented by supplies of weapons around the world, which the United States delivers. And I just want to ask a question. I hope it's not a rhetorical one. When will you finally pay up your contribution to the United Nations budget? I now go back once again to my role as president, and I give the floor to the permanent observer of the observer state of Palestine.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank you, Russia, Algeria, and China for convening this meeting. Allow me also to thank the briefers, and through them, the humanitarian community. Humanitarians in Palestine are trying to deliver on their noble mission in impossible circumstances and at the peril of their life. Our support should match their courage. UNRWA remains under attack. The baseless and shameless terrorism charge against a UN humanitarian agency are no longer a talking point, but a license to kill. The killing, maiming, and arrest of its staff members and the setting ablaze of its headquarters was a direct result of such incitement. The real target of Israel from this attack are the millions of Palestinians who rely on UNRWA to stay alive and to secure their most basic needs. Palestine, listen to the words leading humanitarian NGOs have said a few days ago, and I quote, "Our presence in Gaza is solely due to the unwavering commitment of our colleagues on the ground, despite great risks to their own lives. Our continued presence should not be mistaken for a sign of something worthy of being called access. It is despite its very absence. The risks our colleagues are exposed to each moment are unacceptable. Today, the issue is not just a shrinking humanitarian space. There is hardly any space left to operate at all." End of quotation. These are the ones that should be supported and cheered, not those attacking them, not those killing innocent civilians and anyone trying to help them, rescue them, heal them, feed them, or simply report on their unjust and untimely death. We have collectively failed. This council has failed. We can continue counting aid trucks and speaking of routes and imagining alternatives, but the only true measure of our success is our ability to alleviate human suffering. And the suffering of Palestinians is Israelis' goal and desire. Whatever solutions you come up with, it will continue ensuring they fail until it is forced to change course. And the first indispensable step is an immediate ceasefire. All of you are asking for a ceasefire, immediate one. Then I wonder, who is stopping you from implementing the ceasefire? If you tell me that the mighty Security Council, the 15 of you, including the permanent 5, who are saying that immediate ceasefire, are you going to prevail or allow the criminals to continue to prevail? Make up your mind. If you are the mighty Security Council, unable to control a violator of international law, a criminal killing tens of thousands of Palestinians, then you have to review your authority and your power. We have collectively, I said, failed. There is no speech that can convey the shouts of a child being amputated or dealing with severe burns. The silent agony of a father watching his child turning into bones before his eyes until all life leaves his body. The tears in a doctor's eyes as he counts the days and hours in lives he could not save. The anguish of a mother that has become the first and last line of defense after every shelter was destroyed. As we speak, refugees are running in the streets from one death to another as every school sheltering them has been bombed, as even tents were bombarded, with no regard for human life, for any rule of international law, for any sense of humanity. In a parallel world, Netanyahu stood before the US Congress and claimed Israel was not killing or starving Palestinians. Against all evidence, all logic, and any hint of human decency, his speech was the speech of a warmonger dedicated to the humanization of Palestinians and the denial of their rights. A speech of war, a speech of a person who is against peace. He said this was a clash between civilization and barbarism, as he was conducting barbaric attacks against a civilian population, using a lexicon you know well from the experiences of your own countries. It is the language used across history by colonial powers to justify their atrocities. This Israeli government demands you adhere to its supremacist views and be complicit with its crimes. Anyone who refuses this dictate is duped a terrorism supporter and an anti-Semite. But we will remain steadfast in our defense of humanity and international law, of freedom for the Palestinian people and peace for all, and know many will continue standing by our side in these halls and across the globe, and we are grateful for this support. Mr. President, Vice President Harris is now being criticized by unanimous Israeli sources for speaking the compassion about Palestinian victims. She stated, and I quote, "What has happened in Gaza over the past 9 months is devastating. The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent." End of quotation. And silence here is exactly the goal of those outraged by the fact she evoked the right of the Palestinian people to freedom, dignity, and self-determination. We reiterate here our support for Resolution 2735 and the need to ensure its immediate and full implementation. We need to put an end to this horrific assault and make sure such tragedy never occurs again by sparing no effort to achieve freedom and peace, as both of them go hand in hand. We also express our appreciation to the efforts of China for helping us to put our house in order. In this connection, we also thank Egypt, Algeria, Russia, and many others in this regard. Mr. President, the highest court in the world has concluded that Israel's occupation is illegal and must be brought to an end as rapidly as possible. The ICJ has provided us with its authoritative interpretation of binding rules of international law and spelled out Israel's obligations as well as the obligations of all states and the United Nations. The judges have delivered on their sacred mandate. Now it is time for all states and the UN to perform theirs. We will not ignore a single element that the ICJ articulated in its historic advisory opinion. We will seek the implementation of every detail about this illegal, unlawful, criminal acts against our people by the continuation of this occupation that has to end and end as soon as possible. In the coming weeks, we will act within the General Assembly and the Security Council to ensure this opinion is fully upheld towards a more just, free, and secure Middle East. Life, liberty, human dignity must prevail, and for the international law must be upheld as well. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Palestine for their statement. I now give the floor to Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. What an absurdity to again be called to this council to again discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, especially when this council has failed to hold one single session on the real reasons behind this terrible war, behind the horrific attack on October 7th. The council should be discussing Hamas, a word that I didn't hear from my colleague. He doesn't know that they exist. And its destructive and barbaric agenda to destroy Israel, public agenda, orchestrated by Iran. Iran's intentions are to destroy the Israeli people using currently their terror proxies, in the future also their nuclear capabilities. While we sit here, our hostages are still held in Gaza in the hands of Hamas. Just this week, our forces rescued 5 hostage bodies from a terror tunnel. Where? In a humanitarian zone. Yeah, you heard correctly. hostage bodies in a humanitarian zone. And yet, there has not been one meeting, formal meeting in this council, not on what started the war, and not even to discuss ways to advance the release of the hostages, not even one formal meeting. This fact disgraces the council. Colleagues, Israel is and will always be committed to our extensive humanitarian efforts in the Gaza Strip. When earnestly examining the facts at hand, you will see the immense lengths to which Israel has gone to protect civilian lives. Do you think a country which wants to harm civilians would allow 828,000 tons of aid to enter the Strip? Not from the Egyptian border only, from our borders also. Would such a country permit over 42,000 trucks to enter via land routes, 9,931 pallets of aerial drops, and 432 trucks through the maritime route? It is the State of Israel which organized and facilitated this aid, all while under a massive attacks from Hamas on our own forces, while we facilitate the enter of this aid. We continue to work tirelessly with our international partners to support the people of Gaza. We have facilitated direct and around-the-clock contact between the UN, the IDF Southern Command, and COGAT. But you didn't bother to visit, of course, our side and see the efforts, only the Egyptian side. 11 field hospitals have been established thus far, with 3 under construction. Since October 7th, Israel has consistently ushered in food, water, fuel, medical supplies, and other essentials. Israel stands ready to provide further support. And to those who falsely and maliciously claim that Israel has prevented the provision of aid, the real numbers show that of the 42,000 aid trucks, less than 1% have been refused entry since October, and only for security reasons. But of course, the UN representatives are only focused on and amplify this 1%. At the same time, the UN finds itself overwhelmed by the aid being provided, which it is unable to distribute because of UN's problems. The failure to distribute the aid is the main reason for the bottleneck. Why is this not the topic of today's discussion? While Israel meets its obligations, the world is being fed casualty numbers and data by the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health. How can we even hold a session on the situation in Gaza without verifiable data? Why hasn't the Security Council called a meeting to ask the UN for an independent process to secure reputable information rather than trusting the words of child killers and rapists? Not only does the UN falter in its duties to coordinate aid distribution, but its agency, UNRWA, is complicit in the perpetuation of this conflict. We have provided Commissioner Lazzarini more than 100 names and military IDs of terrorist operatives currently employed by UNRWA in Gaza. You pay their salaries here. This list is part of an ongoing process and does not yet reveal the full extent of the infiltration of UNRWA by the Hamas terrorists. Why has UNRWA failed to terminate, up until today, these terrorist employees? We have also discovered numerous UNRWA facilities and headquarters used by Hamas to provide humanitarian cover for their crimes. You like to call them schools. Hamas tunnels and weapons warehouses were found under 30 UNRWA schools. How can you claim that these facilities are entitled to protection? Why are we not here discussing the desecration of these schools by Hamas and UNRWA? Why has this never been discussed? Never. Why doesn't the Security Council invite an international law expert to brief this council that a school used for terror has lost its protection under international law? Probably if you invite one, you'll invite a Palestinian legal expert, I assume. Hamas has twisted much of the aid intended for civilians into weapons of war. Where we see a water pipe, Hamas sees a rocket. Where we see a hospital, Hamas sees a headquarters. Where we see a school, Hamas sees terror tunnels. On October 7th, terrorists invaded our homes, raping, murdering, and kidnapping our civilians. May I remind you again, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip 19 years ago. Today, Hamas terrorists continue to strike Israeli villages from designated humanitarian zones. Hezbollah rains down thousands of rockets and UAVs upon our north, burning town after town. Still, we have 100,000 Israelis that were displaced from their northern communities. And just last week, the Houthis struck Tel Aviv after more than 200 attacks since October 7th. You call it clashes. Until you address the head of the snake in Tehran, there is no way to bring stability to the region. Only a blind person or someone with a political agenda would not see this as a coordinated attack by proscribed terror groups to terrorize our citizens. Every single one of you knows that the reaction to this attack would look, the reaction would look like if it targeted Moscow, London, Beijing, Paris, or Washington instead of Israel. Mr. President, 115 hostages are still held captive by Hamas Nazis. The most crucial element for the end of this conflict has been excluded from this conversation. And it's not enough to remind their existence as a footnote. We cannot simply stand by as our men, women, and children remain at the mercy of these mutilators. Again, where is the meeting demanding the return of our hostages? Without their immediate and unconditional release, there is no hope for peace and security. When the brutalities of Iran and its proxies are dismissed, Israel must take its future into its own hands. We will continue to carry out the necessary operations to defeat Hamas, along with anyone who attacks our citizens. Ultimately, Israel remains committed to providing life-saving aid to Gaza, while Hamas only remains committed to destroying lives. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Israel for their statement. I just want to say that any meeting of Security Council on the humanitarian situation in Gaza implies discussing the issue of hostages, which was the case today. We all know the recipe, the formula, and I think I speak on behalf of all members of the Council when I say that we do know what the formula is. A ceasefire is needed for that. Without that, it will not happen, unfortunately. I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. President. I make the statement on behalf of the Arab Group. In the beginning, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Arab Group for holding this session on the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip due to the continued Israeli aggression and in light of the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I would like to thank Ms. Antonia De Mario and Mr. Muhannad Hadi for their important briefings and for providing information from the ground. Mr. President, the Israeli aggression against the Gaza Strip has led to an unprecedented humanitarian disaster, according to all UN agencies and relief agencies on the ground. We have listened to the repeated calls and warnings by these organizations that point that the Gaza Strip is turning into an uninhabitable disaster area, and the situation is especially dire for children. They confirmed that the only way to save civilians in the Gaza Strip is an immediate and sustainable ceasefire. However, Israeli military attacks against the Gaza Strip have continued unabated, with the scarcity of medical and health care, the spread of disease, and the lack of food, medicine, and shelter. This is done in a deliberate, systematic policy by the Israeli occupation that uses starvation as a weapon of war and humanitarian assistance as a bargaining chip. This has aggravated humanitarian suffering in the Gaza Strip, and all warnings have translated into a reality in light of the continued war of genocide by Israel against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, which violates all international standards in the disregard for Security Council relevant resolutions and its commitments as the occupying power. At the same time, Israel is preventing and obstructing the entry of assistance into the Gaza Strip and its distribution to those in need through its continued attacks on the relief operations and the points of distribution and storage, and also humanitarian workers are under threat and are targeted with 500 killed. This is the highest number ever recorded in any conflict across the world. Further, the Israeli invasion of Rafah in May has led to the forced collective displacement and an increase in the number of civilian casualties and the closing of main crossings and imposing more restrictions. This has led to a halt in medical evacuation and depriving Gaza of humanitarian aid. In the past weeks, Israel continued to bomb the Gaza Strip, including attacks against schools run by the UN and that are used as shelters for those displaced, and now there's no safe place in the Gaza Strip for those displaced to seek refuge. Most hospitals in the Gaza Strip are out of service. Medical teams are being targeted and arrested. This has led to a complete medical breakdown in Gaza, where the medical sector is unable to respond to the number of injuries that is on the rise due to Israel's continued targeting of Palestinian civilians, even in their displacement tents. Mr. President, the humanitarian suffering in Gaza must be addressed in a more decisive and serious manner. We cannot remain idle, just watching this shocking suffering in the Gaza Strip, as Israel continues to close and destroy crossing points. It continues to obstruct the delivery of aid into the Gaza Strip, where the aid that is blocked is lining at the gates. We cannot allow Israel to recount inaccurate figures on the number of trucks entering the Strip. This is not the true measure of the effectiveness of humanitarian response. It is the assistance reaching those in need, especially in the north, that is the true measure, in addition to the type of assistance that is allowed into the Gaza Strip, and this is obstructed by Israel par excellence. Mr. President, an immediate and sustainable ceasefire and commitment to IHL and opening all crossing points into Gaza for commercial and humanitarian supplies is the only means to meet the humanitarian basic needs of the civilians. Israel, as the occupying power, is responsible for providing such access and facilitating it. We call upon the Security Council to bring pressure to bear on Israel towards a ceasefire and allowing relief operations in the Gaza Strip to be conducted safely so that the international community would respond to the humanitarian suffering in Gaza in a more effective manner to save civilians and to start the healing and recovery process. The Arab group reaffirms the need for immediate action before it's too late. Here, we value the continued efforts by the Arab Republic of Egypt and the State of Qatar towards reaching a ceasefire deal and to ease the suffering in Gaza. In closing, Mr. President, the Arab group would like to thank all humanitarian organizations working in the Gaza Strip despite all the risks and challenges, and we thank them for their determination to ease the suffering of Palestinians. We provide all support and solidarity with these organizations and their teams in their noble mission, in particular the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, which is targeted by an Israeli smearing campaign. We call upon the international community to stand against this illegal campaign and to provide UNRWA with financial and political support, that we are all aware that the provision of all assistance in the Gaza Strip is impossible without UNRWA spearheading the relief operations, especially in the areas of education and health. I thank you.
I thank Iraq for that statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.